All right, welcome back to Pursuing Discipleship. Bar with me here as I get prepared. So, what I wanted to do is I wanted to go over, start a marriage series, and it's just going to be a four-part series where, this is a lot of the stuff that I used to cover with couples when I would do marriage coaching and counseling. And I think that there's some I don't know the right way to say this. Maybe the marriage counseling kind of leaves a bad taste in people's mouths because a lot of times it's kind of the same old. And I say that from experience because, there was a time when I had a very difficult marriage, and I went to marriage counseling on multiple occasions with multiple different counselors. And I struggled to feel like it really helped, and it's not because they didn't have Bible verses, and it's not because they didn't tell me things that were true. It's because I felt like it didn't really address, all aspects of things that needed to be addressed. And so I've since over the past, 5 years or so, had put together, a four-part series that I'm going to go through, and we're going to work through this. And hopefully, if you're out there and you'd like to work on building your marriage stronger, or maybe it's struggling and you're trying to recover your marriage, then I would encourage you to take the time to go through this series. And I would also encourage you to go through it with your spouse, if possible. If they're willing to sit down with you and go through this, then that would be great. And I would highly encourage you guys to make this a point to do this together. And so we're going to start through this. And this is called Building or Rebuilding a Marriage God's Way. And then this first part is really going to be focusing on communication and understanding the problems with poor communication. And so, with that being said, we're going to dive right in here. And one of the things that I came across, and I will say this before we get too deep into this, almost everything that I'm going to share with you is stuff that I learned the hard way. And I learned through trial and error and difficulty and agony and struggle. And so I really hope that I'm going to help you maybe take a shorter path than I did to come through a lot of these lessons and these points. And that's not to say that I've got it all figured out or that I necessarily even practice everything that I'm going to talk to you about all the time. But nonetheless, I believe these things are true. And I think if you implement these things and pay close attention to these things we're going to cover, it will definitely make an improvement and a difference in your marriage. And so the first thing is, just because you're talking doesn't mean you're communicating. And this is a big principle to really keep in mind, is because just because we're speaking at somebody doesn't mean there's effective communication. And a lot of times, and I'm sure if you've ever been in a relationship that was struggling, or having some difficulty, it felt like you're just talking right past each other. One person's talking and the other person's not listening, and they're talking back and you're not listening, and it's just like, man, lots of words that are just missing. And so, it's important to remember. Move this guy out the way so you can see what I'm showing. Are you building a bridge, or are you building a wall with the bricks that you're laying? And it reminds me of this idea. If I said, hey, you know what, I need you to build me a brick house, and then I just brought somebody in who had no real experience or skill in laying brick, and I just gave them a pile of bricks. I said, get to work. And they might well start building bricks together, but it's probably not going to build the prettiest or the nicest of houses if there's no skill involved. And so a lot of the stuff we're going to cover is going to be related to some of the skills that I think are important to communication and some of the pitfalls to remember along the way. And so if you're not building a bridge, you may be building a wall. And that's what we're going to cover. So once again, two people who do not know how to effectively communicate can end up doing more harm than good. And I definitely felt like this was me at a point in time. I had gotten to the point where I had just stopped communicating altogether. I would sit there quietly. I would let the words come, and I would, quote unquote, endure, another one of the talks. But there was no real communication taking place. And if that's you today, just hang in there. We're gonna address some of the things that are going to be very pertinent to you. And so This is a quote that I came across some years back as I was going through my own transformation, and it says, "The problem with communication is the illusion that it is taking place." And I don't know about you, but there's been plenty of times in my life where, a conversation happens, you feel like, okay, well, maybe we got, figured out, or, I understand what you said, you understand what I said. Maybe there's a plan or there's an expectation, then we go our separate ways, and then it's completely does not pan out the way I thought. It's like, what, how did that get missed? How in the world did that not get clearly understood? I mean, I just can't explain it. And you can get, oh, I used to get so frustrated. But once again, it's because there was not effective communication, even if there was a words exchange. So, how well are you and your spouse communicating? And so, when I started my own journey in my marriage transformation and learning communication skills, I had to ask myself, what am I doing here? Right? When I would go to marriage counseling, why am I here? What am I trying to accomplish? And there's different levels of reasons why people show up, right? It could be that, well, I'm here because my wife wants me here, or because my husband wants me here. That's why I'm sitting here. You might be sitting here right now watching this video thinking, yep, that's why I'm here. I'm just trying to appease, right? And maybe that's the case for you. Hopefully that's not the case for you, but maybe that's where you start now. It could be that this is strategic because you're just trying to avoid an argument. And if you can just endure this video, then maybe, just maybe, we can get to sleep tonight without another fight, right? Maybe that's you here. Maybe you're not quite so cynical and you're thinking to yourself, well, a better relationship would be nice, but there's not a whole lot of confidence that it's actually going to come to fruition. And so, yeah, I mean, you have this idea that, you'd be nice, probably not going to happen. Could be that you want a better relationship with your spouse. Maybe your level of interest or desire is a little bit higher than that. And you're like, no, I want one. I want this relationship to improve. And, I hope that we're getting closer and closer, warmer and warmer to where you're at in your head tonight as you watch this video. Are you ready to do whatever it takes to have a better relationship? Right. And I will say this. Now we're getting into the part where we need to be to actually build or recover a damaged relationship to something better. And it comes to being willing to do whatever it takes to have a better relationship. And to go along with that, there has to be a certain level of commitment because here's the thing, when you start making changes, right? And this is true of anything, doesn't matter if it's your health, it doesn't matter if it's, some habit, or it doesn't matter if it's your marriage. If you start trying to make it better, it's not going to automatically be better all the time, right? There's going to still be roadblocks. There's going to still be the lows. There's going to still be the disagreements and the arguments and all the things that we're going to continue to talk about in this video. And so you have to be committed enough to weather the ups and downs of the journey, right? So are you willing to do whatever it takes? And you might say, yeah, but I'm only willing to do it until the very first negative interaction, and then I'm done. Then I'm throwing in the towel because once again, I'm right back to where I was in my expectations. And so you got to have that commitment level that's going to carry you through the bumps, especially in the early stages of recovery. And I will tell you, I know exactly what it means to come to the point of like do or die. Like, man, it's like all in. It's got to be all in or nothing, right? And this is true at any real significant change that takes place in a person's life. They have to come to that point where they get serious enough to say, all right, no more. I'm all in. That's what it takes. And I hope for you and your spouse's sake, this is where both of you find yourselves. And so I'll just reiterate that there's all types of reasons, right? There's lots of reasons why a person would come to a marriage course, why a person would go to counselors, or why a person might sit here and watch a YouTube video about marriage. And if you want to have the best possible result with your marriage, you need to kind of have a gut check with yourself and with one another about, am I here with the right intention? Am I here with the right level of commitment? And am I willing to give it a fair shot? Because if you're just here to prove that it's not going to work, but you got to check the box before you can tell the other person, see, I told you so, it's not going to work, right? Then it's not going to work because your attitude's not right. So get yourself in the right headspace, recognize that this is possible, but you got to approach it with the right attitude. So let's look at what happens when we have negative outcomes and when we experience those negative outcomes of communication too often, right? Because what ends up happening is negative outcomes in our communication ends up developing bad habits in our communication. And whether that could be, getting interrupted or interrupting back or not listening anymore or whatever your negative habits of communication are. And I promise you, don't ask, but your spouse knows exactly what your negative habits are. When we develop these bad habits in our communication, that will ultimately lead to worse outcomes, right? Because those bad habits that begin, they affect those negative outcomes and they will become, it's kind of like a vicious cycle that spirals down and further and further. And so those habits begin to affect their outcomes. And then those outcomes start to develop into assumptions about what to expect. And if you've gotten yourself into a pattern of, man, it just seems like we always argue. It seems like the other person's never satisfied, or the other person just, always wants to blame, or whatever the case is. And I've been in all those assumptions about what to expect will ultimately feed right back into our negative communication habits. Because if I don't expect anything good's going to happen, then there's no real reason to give my best effort at making this work because it's just going to go sour anyways, right? If that's my attitude, it's going to have a big impact on whether or not I'm actually putting in the work or whether I'm going to assume it's just going to go negative no matter what I do, right? And so once again, these continued negative outcomes become beliefs about what will always happen, right? As we build those walls. That's why I had on that first slide, are you building a bridge or are you building a wall? Because that will become walls as those negative interactions more consistently experienced over time become expectations that become beliefs about what will always happen. And then ultimately, those beliefs turn into those walls, which turn into silence and distance and avoidance and all the things that, eventually lead to broken homes. And so we have to cut this off. We have to recognize that this pattern and that this escalation of negative consequence exists. And no matter where you find yourself, if you're somewhere on this path, doesn't matter because there's no such thing as too far gone. There's no such thing as unrecoverable, if I can use that word. But we have to be honest about where we are. We have to be honest about, not just where your spouse is, but where you are, right? Where are you? And maybe you're at the very bottom of this list and you're just hunkered down in complete distance and avoidance and silence. That's okay. It's not a great place to be and to find yourself, but we can work ourselves out of it. So just bear with me. Coming on the tails now, the coattails of that idea of negative assumptions, we have to address what are the expectations in the relationship when it comes to communication, right? What do you expect to happen? But more importantly, because you already know what you expect to happen, what's more important to do is to consider and to thoughtfully, contemplate what does your spouse expect to happen? Because that's going to drive their communication habits back to you. And so, although it can be difficult to put yourself into their shoes and have an objective perspective, just for a moment, think about your communication history for the past 6 months or the past year or however long you feel like the communication hasn't been good and give an honest evaluation to yourself. How well does your communication go? And you might be thinking, well, it's terrible. Maybe you're thinking, it's not terrible. It's not as good as I want it, but it's not terrible. No matter where it is, this is going to apply to your situation. And so, is your communication productive and does it leave you both feeling better? Because ultimately, that's where the goal is. That's where we're heading towards in these lessons is learning how to get to communication that is productive and effective. Does it lead to someone getting frustrated? That was me. So one of you always seem to just shut down and avoid even having the conversation. That was me, right? These are all patterns that can develop. And so think about this. How do you think your spouse's expectation about you or in what they can expect to get in return from you, how do you think their expectation affects their willingness to participate and engage in communication efforts? Right. And once again, this is tough because the natural tendency is to look at every situation from our own lens and to feel very justified or to feel very offended or to feel very much like, if I'm not the problem. But the truth is, there's no such thing as a 100% the other person's always the problem in every case. And so we have to try to recognize in what way are my habits or in what way is my inability to effectively communicate causing my spouse to not communicate well back with me. Excuse me. So, like I said, this takes some kind of introspection and a little bit of reflection, but it's worth it if you can just work through that exercise in the privacy of your own mind, be honest with yourself. How is your communication hurting your spouse's ability to effectively communicate back to you? So it leads us to a principle. The first principle we're going to talk about is that nobody changes their mind just because they're told they should, regardless of whether or not. I'm not sure why that's cut off in the middle. It's supposed to say, regardless of whether or not they give verbal assent. And so what that means is even if your spouse says, yeah, okay, fine, I agree with you. Yeah, okay, you're right. That doesn't mean they're convinced of it or they actually believe it. It just means they're trying to exit sometimes. It could be that they're exiting the conversation. They're just capitulating or they're, giving in, so to speak, surrendering the cause. What changes people's minds in the second point is that people change their minds when they believe that they have observed enough evidence to convince them otherwise. It comes down to evidence. And we'll get to this later in some of the later videos when it comes to trust and providing evidence that a person is worthy of trust. But in this particular case, when it comes to communication, for somebody to change their mind about what they expect from a communication effort, there has to be evidence of the change. Otherwise, there's no reason for them to change their mind about what they expect. And so understand if you have a pretty long, heavy history of some negative interactions, neither one of you is going to be able to just flip the light switch in your mind and say, okay, fine, we're going to start communicating good. It's not going to work that simple, right? There's going to be some time of having to prove and demonstrate that they can actually expect something different. Because if you say it's going to be different and then it's not ever different, you're basically handing them more bricks to build the wall instead of the bridge, right? So you got to focus on evidence. And then you have to ask, how do you think your actions, attitudes, and words are affecting their perception of evidence? Would they conclude that the evidence is mostly good or mostly bad? And once again, you have to really, really try hard to look at this from their perspective because it's we always assume that our actions, attitudes, and words are on the most part justified and validated and all that because nobody really operates in the assuming I'm wrong state of mind. And so you have to be willing to set aside your personal bias and do your best to see things from their perspective. What evidence are you giving them for them to believe that attempts at communication will start to be different? That's an important thing to recognize. And if we want a better marriage, we must be willing to confront the sometimes difficult truths regarding our current situation. Sometimes that truth is, I'm not doing very well, or I'm contributing to the problem, or something about the way I communicate doesn't work and I have to change it. So keep in mind, you have to provide tangible evidence if you want your partner or your spouse to start being willing to have communication efforts again. All right, so where are you focusing during your attempts to communicate? This is some important stuff, guys. I'm telling you, these are powerful principles. Here's the difference. What I cannot control, okay? This is what I can't control. I have no control if my My spouse listens for the purpose of understanding me, right? I have no control over that. She may well be listening for the point of argument or to make her next point. Don't control that. What do I control? I control if I listen to understand. I don't control if my spouse interrupts me. What do I control? I control if I interrupt them. Okay. I don't control their emotions. I don't control my wife's emotions. You know what I do control? You guessed it. I control my emotions, or I should be controlling my emotions. And once again, I don't control their inner dialogue. My wife, like what's going on in her mind? She's starting to have negative thoughts. Is she starting to spiral? Is she getting agitated and irritated? And right? I don't control that. I control my internal dialogue. What am I telling myself about the situation and about what needs to happen next and about how I need to talk or how I need to approach what I'm saying? If you focus on what you cannot control, and we're going to see this in the next slide or two, it's super frustrating. And if you focus on what you can control, you have the ability to contribute something positive to the conversation. And so this is what we're going to talk about next. Principle number 2 is that you should not focus on what you can not control. Right? I'm going to move this so you can read that. Don't focus on what you can or can't control. Focus on what you can influence. What do I mean by that? If you focus on controlling something, and yet it's something that you can't control, it starts to make you feel powerless. You're like, oh, there's nothing I can do. I remember when I was coaching a couple and the husband kept telling me, there's nothing I can do. It's hopeless. There's no way I can do anything. Nothing that I can do matters. It's because he was so focused on the things he can't control, he was missing the things that he can influence, right? Because there's always something you can do to try to influence in a positive way. Same thing. When you focus on what you can or can't control, it makes you want to quit trying because it just feels hopeless. On the contrast, when you focus on what you can influence, it helps you look for ways to keep trying because there's always a way you can try to make another influence. Even if it's something I don't totally control, I can do something that might influence it in a positive way, right? It questions the point of giving effort. This seems like a waste of my time, right? Doesn't matter what I do. She's going to this or he's going to that. Otherwise, you can recognize that there's always something else you can do. And the results feel 100% based on your spouse's actions or reactions, as opposed to you believe that you can influence the results, right? And once again, this comes down to what's our mindset? Is it all about what I can or can't control? In which case, I feel hopeless. I feel like I want to try or quit trying. There's no point in any of this. It all comes down to them, which ultimately leads to they're all to blame. That's where this thinking goes. They're all to blame instead of recognizing that, no, there's something I can do different. I'm going to keep trying to be creative. I'm going to think of a different way to say what I'm trying to say. I believe there's a way I can make some kind of positive impact. And it's a mindset shift that is massively important. It leads to discouragement versus also can be encouraging through the prospect of hope that maybe there is something that I can do that will help. Now, remember the verse, 1 Peter 3:7. It says, husbands, likewise dwell with your wives according to understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of God. There's two different times we're going to look at this verse in this lesson. First one is according to understanding. Husbands, this is so important. You have to understand your wife or seek to understand your wife. And I'm not talking about this generic idea where, guys like to throw out there, well, all women are this and all women are that. No, because not all women are the same. Your wife is uniquely her, and you need to study to understand your wife specifically. Okay, this is important. Every wife wants to be understood and to be heard and to feel valued, regardless of whether or not you think you're doing all those things. It needs to be felt. And so this takes work to understand your wife, right? Don't take a generic high level 30,000-foot view and just be like, well, generally I know what a wife is supposed to this and I know what a husband's supposed to that. None of that matters. We're not dealing in generics. We're dealing in the specifics of your particular wife. So keep that in mind. And so where is your focus? A person cannot be effectively focused on understanding their spouse and blaming them or arguing with them at the same time. You're either in one space in your mind or you're in the other. And so if your marriage is struggling, if your communication is struggling, it's very likely that you and your spouse, most likely both of you, are stuck in the blaming, arguing mindset instead of trying to understand. How can I understand their perspective? How can I understand why they feel the way they feel? Why they say what they say, right? Why they think the way they think. Right? All that needs to be prioritized above the blaming and the arguing. It's going to be one or the other. It can never be both at the same time. And so, what happens when we don't understand? We form wrong conclusions. Those wrong conclusions cause us to respond incorrectly. And then we experience feelings and emotions that are oftentimes misplaced, right? Have you ever had your spouse just like get super irritated or take something you say totally the wrong way and they just fly out the handle and you're like, oh my gosh, that's not what I was meaning at all. What the heck are they, in the next, and then all of a sudden you're off to the races with a spiral. We have to take time to understand so we don't experience or, feelings or emotions that are misplaced. And we don't develop wrong expectations because we will, if we don't understand, we will have wrong expectations. So I want to look at this passage because there's something really cool here. In Acts chapter 9, there's a point where we see right after Saul's conversion to Paul, it says, "And Ananias answered and said, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much harm he has done your saints in Jerusalem." Verse 26, it says, "And when Saul had come to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him and did not believe that he was a disciple. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the disciples, and he declared to them how he had seen the Lord on the road, and that he had spoken to him, and how he had preached boldly at Damascus in the name of Jesus." And so the rest of the disciples are like, we have a reputation, that guy's got a reputation. We're not going anywhere near that guy, Saul, because we know all the trouble and the problems of the past. And we're not going anywhere near that with a 10-foot pole. And Barnabas comes along and says, no, I'm going to bridge build here. And as a result, Paul was eventually welcomed in by the disciples, and the ministry continued to flourish. And the thing to keep in mind is that the past was not a predictor of the future. God changed Saul, and God can change your spouse and you as well. So, despite the past of your marriage, that is not a predictor of the future. If you and your spouse are committed to following the Lord and letting the Holy Spirit work inside of you and change you from the inside out, don't get caught in the trap of assuming that just because the past is one way, it's always going to be that way. The disciples had beliefs about Saul based on their assumptions and knowledge of the past. And in this case, those assumptions were wrong because Paul was a totally new person. And your spouse and yourself can also experience being totally new people. As we know from 2 Corinthians 5:17, that whoever's in Christ is a new creation, all things are new. But it took Barnabas to build the bridge, right? It took somebody to step forward and say, I'm going to build the bridge. And think about this. How long would it have been where there was a breakdown between Saul or Paul and then the rest of the disciples if it wasn't for Barnabas stepping in? That relationship could have struggled for years. It's possible that relationship never would have been built. But Barnabas took the initiative and built the bridge. How long, and the principle I'm making here is, how long is your relationship going to possibly struggle and struggle and struggle if one of you is unwilling to step forward outside of your own sense of hurt or wrong and start building the bridge? Are you a Barnabas in your marriage? This is something that everybody needs to challenge themselves about, because ultimately everyone's accountable for themselves. You don't control your spouse, but you do control yourself. So understanding our assumptions and thought processes and where they come from, this is important. Our current relationship past, meaning the relationship that you're in right now with your spouse, whatever's happened from the beginning of that relationship till now has shaped their assumptions and their thought processes and what they expect. And then you also have all the previous relationships before the one that you're in now, right? Because That person very well could have had other relationships or other, situations that have influenced and shaped their thinking and their expectations and their assumptions. And those carry forward. They matter. They have to be understood. Our family upbringing definitely plays a part. I got a long story for another day, but I definitely had some carry forward from my family upbringing that played a negative part in my relationships. And then we have all of our regular personal experiences in our lives, things that we observe, things that we experience. It all shapes us. And if you really want to understand your spouse, you have to understand all these categories because they all play a part in shaping who they are. And then this is something important to remember. Your spouse isn't the way they are for no reason, right? There's a reason. You have to think about what is the reason. And the better you understand what shaped them, the more able you'll be to effectively communicate with them. And quite honestly, it's very possible your negative history with them has been part of what shaped them. So you have to be uh, patient and understanding with one another to recognize this might take time to unravel the knot. And there may be a tendency to want to point the finger back at each other and say, well, you're the reason I'm like this. I would guard against that. Okay. Guard against that. Another thing, super important. I know I'm going fast, but I want to make this video not a million hours long. So, in fight or flight during conflict, right? Because there's two primary responses to conflict, and you have the first person that's like, "I'm just out. I'm out of here. I'm not doing this. I can't stand it. I just hate it. I hate conflict." And so they have their primary need is peace and calm. And so the conflict removes the feelings of peace and harmony. And so they're going to avoid conflict at all costs, including shutting down in silence because they just need calm and peace and they can't handle the conflict, right? And that's the one approach. And then you have the other side of the equation, which is the fight person. And their primary need is connection and resolution. And so the conflict removes the feelings of connection and stability and resolution. And so they will pursue resolution at all costs, resolution at all costs, including escalation. And so when you recognize which maybe you're one or the other and your spouse is the other one, right? You can see, hopefully, if you take a minute, you can see where opposing approaches to conflict can be toxically difficult. Because if one person is just avoiding and fleeing because they can't handle conflict, and the other person has to pursue resolution at all costs, imagine it's a recipe for disaster if you don't understand what makes your spouse tick when it comes to how they communicate through conflict. Neither's right or wrong, right? I'm not going to say that one's over the other, one's better, one's worse. They're just different. And if you can understand why your spouse responds to conflict the way they do, you can better understand how you need to approach them in order to find the resolution that is ultimately what both parties are seeking. So, what should you expect on this journey? Well, this is going to be the encouraging slide. Just kidding. You're going to experience failure from yourself sometimes. You're going to get failure from your spouse sometimes. You're going to get difficulty. You're going to have internal struggles to not want to do what you know is the right thing to do, and it's going to suck when you feel that way. Isn't that uplifting? You're going to have conflict. And the reason I'm telling you this is because you need to be realistic about the fact that everything doesn't change overnight, right? This marriage, if you find yourself in a tough spot and poor communication and breakdown in the relationship, it didn't happen overnight. It's been a process of negativity that has gotten it to where it is now. And it's going to be a process of positivity that has to slowly work itself out. Don't set your expectations so high that the first sign of struggle, you get deflated. You're like, oh, I knew it was hopeless. I knew this would never work. And you just throw in the towel, like we just talked about earlier, with having that level of commitment to weather the volatility that you're inevitably going to feel in these early stages. But what else? What else can happen on this journey? Growth, personal growth for yourself and for your spouse. Understanding of one another can happen on this journey. Closeness can happen on this journey. That's emotional closeness, increased intimacy. And I'm not talking just about the sexual kind. I'm talking about a knowing, a deeper knowing and connection that can come from better communication, stronger communication, right? As you learn skills and help yourselves learn to navigate these conversations. Forgiveness. This is a big one that can happen with relationships that have struggled for a long time. There could be a lot of burden and bitterness built up, and then ultimately healing, right? The reward is worth the struggle. And don't let anybody tell you any different. It is worth it to battle through to the end. So things to remember as we close. You and your spouse are on the same team, right? First Peter 3:7. We talked about this verse. Husbands likewise dwell with your wives according to understanding, and as being heirs together. You and your spouse are heirs together. You are on the same team. This is not a you versus me. It should be an understanding that, you know what, the conflict is the enemy. And we need to team up and battle against the conflict that is tearing down our household. First Thessalonians 5:11, therefore encourage one another and build each other up, right? This is going to be a challenge and it's going to require you to work together and try to be an encouragement to one another because you're both going to have times where it feels so hard. Learn to start building each other up. Your communication has to be intentional. Proverbs 21:23, it says, those who guard their mouths and their tongues keep themselves from calamity, right? If you're somebody who struggles with word vomiting when you get frustrated or upset or you get into a fight, you better start being intentional about watching what you say. Proverbs 18:21, the tongue has the power of life and death. Those who love it will eat of its fruit. The communication component in a marriage cannot be understated. It is critically important, and you are either building or destroying your relationship with the communication that is taking place. Understand its significance, prioritize its intentionality, and start building something great. So that's the end of our slideshow. I really hope this has been helpful. I hope that you and your spouse will find these videos profitable, and that I'll be praying for you guys that you'll be able to put these things into practice. You'll be able to lean on the Holy Spirit, and He will help you build that closeness and build that connection through navigating your way through these communication pitfalls and building these better habits. So with that, I will bid you farewell and have a great night.